"Sir, the service entrance is around back." The laughter came fast after that, soft at first, then louder when the woman behind the marble counter realized nobody was going to stop her. Rainwater dripped from the sleeves of Malcolm Hayes's faded brown jacket and spotted the polished showroom floor in tiny dark circles while the bright white ceiling lights reflected against rows of spotless luxury cars worth more than most people's homes. Malcolm stood still near the entrance, 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad shoulders slightly wet from the storm outside, his old work boots leaving faint tracks across the stone tiles as cold November wind slipped in through the automatic glass doors behind him. The receptionist glanced toward 2 salesmen standing near a silver coupe and smirked. "Seriously," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound cruel instead of loud, "you can't stand around in here looking like that." One of the salesmen laughed through his nose without even trying to hide it. Another customer standing nearby slowly turned away, pretending not to notice. Malcolm looked around the showroom quietly. Warm jazz music floated through hidden speakers overhead while the scent of expensive leather and fresh wax filled the air. A giant American flag hung from the second-floor balcony beside a glowing crystal chandelier, everything in the building designed to make wealthy people feel important the second they walked inside. But Malcolm had seen places like this before. Places where respect arrived before a conversation if your watch looked expensive enough. Places where people measured human value in shoes, accents, and skin color before they ever learned your name. The receptionist folded her arms tighter across her blazer and forced a smile that looked sharp around the edges. "Sir, these vehicles start around $120,000. Her eyes moved slowly over his jacket, his boots, then his dark skin. "I just don't want you wasting your time." Malcolm gave a small nod like he had heard those words his entire life. Maybe he had. Water slid from the edge of his sleeve as he stepped farther into the showroom anyway, moving carefully between 2 polished SUVs while employees nearby exchanged looks with each other. A young white salesman whispered something under his breath, and another worker chuckled hard enough to nearly spill his coffee. Malcolm stopped beside a deep black luxury sedan displayed beneath a spotlight in the center of the room. The paint shimmered like glass beneath the overhead lighting. He reached out slowly and brushed a single finger across the hood, wiping away a thin layer of dust almost too small to see. "Hey," one salesman snapped instantly, walking toward him fast. "Don't touch the car." The entire showroom suddenly felt quieter. Rain tapped softly against the giant front windows while Malcolm looked at the reflection staring back at him in the polished black paint. Calm eyes. Tired eyes. The kind of eyes that learned long ago how humiliation sounded before it arrived. Then another voice cut through the silence from the staircase above. "Cold. Smooth. Controlled. What exactly is going on down there?" Every employee straightened immediately when Ethan Whitmore appeared at the top landing in his tailored navy suit, one hand resting casually on the glass railing as he looked down at Malcolm like he already knew the answer. Ethan Whitmore descended the staircase slowly, polished dress shoes barely making a sound against the dark walnut steps while every employee on the showroom floor suddenly straightened their posture the second they saw him. The man carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from years of expensive success, silver cuff links glinting beneath the bright lights as he adjusted the sleeve of his tailored jacket and looked directly at Malcolm Hayes standing beside the black sedan. Rain rolled down the giant front windows behind them in thin silver streaks while soft jazz continued playing overhead like nothing uncomfortable was happening at all. Ethan stopped at the bottom step and glanced briefly toward the salesman standing near Malcolm. "Problem?" he asked calmly. The salesman smirked. "Guy keeps touching the vehicles." Ethan finally turned his full attention toward Malcolm, eyes moving from the worn boots to the faded jacket still damp from the storm outside. For a second, he did not speak. That silence felt colder than the November air slipping beneath the entrance doors every time customers walked in. Malcolm stood still with one hand resting lightly at his side, shoulders relaxed, expression unreadable. Ethan gave a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "Sir," he said smoothly, "this showroom is private property." Malcolm nodded once. "I understand that. Then you understand why my staff may be concerned. The receptionist near the marble counter tried not to smile too obviously while another salesman folded his arms and leaned against a white SUV worth nearly $180,000. Malcolm glanced around the room quietly again. He noticed everything. The older white couple pretending not to stare. The young employee near the coffee station who looked uncomfortable but stayed silent anyway. The polished chrome reflections across the floor. The expensive watches. The practiced smiles. It reminded him of a memory he had carried since childhood. His mother standing in the lobby of a downtown office building after midnight wearing a janitor uniform while businessmen walked past her like she was invisible. Malcolm had been 9 years old then, sitting quietly on a plastic chair while she emptied trash cans floor by floor. He still remembered the sound of her rubber cleaning gloves snapping against her wrist and the way tired fluorescent lights reflected against freshly mopped tile. One night a man in a gray suit had dropped coffee across the lobby floor and blamed her for being in the way. She apologized even though she had done nothing wrong. On the ride home she looked out the bus window and told Malcolm something he never forgot. "People will decide your worth before you ever open your mouth," she had said softly. "Do not let them decide your heart too." Standing inside the luxury showroom now, Malcolm could almost hear her voice beneath the rain tapping against the glass outside. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice enough to sound controlled instead of openly rude. "If you are looking for a dealership with lower price points, I can recommend somewhere a little more practical." A few employees laughed quietly again. Malcolm looked directly at him for the first time. Calm eyes. Steady breathing. "I did not come here for practical," he said. Ethan smiled thinly. "Then what exactly did you come here for?" Malcolm glanced once more at the black sedan beneath the showroom spotlight, his reflection stretching across the polished paint beside the reflections of everyone staring at him. Then he answered in a voice so even it almost made the room more uncomfortable. "I came to see how your employees treat people they think do not matter." The room stayed quiet for half a second after Malcolm Hayes spoke, the kind of silence that only happens when people suddenly realize a conversation is no longer funny. Rain continued sliding down the towering glass windows facing the dark Chicago street outside while the soft jazz overhead somehow made everything feel even colder. Ethan Whitmore stared at Malcolm carefully now, his expression tightening just slightly as if trying to decide whether the man standing in front of him was serious or simply arrogant. Behind them, the receptionist shifted uncomfortably near the marble counter, though the smugness had not fully left her face. One salesman scoffed under his breath and shook his head. "Come on," he muttered quietly. "This guy cannot be serious." Malcolm heard him. He heard all of them. Years of being underestimated had sharpened his ability to hear disrespect even when people tried to bury it beneath polite smiles. Ethan folded his hands calmly in front of him, every movement measured and controlled like a man used to being obeyed the second he entered a room. "You are questioning my employees?" he asked. Malcolm glanced across the showroom floor again. Bright reflections stretched across polished stone beneath rows of imported vehicles lined up like sculptures inside a museum. Everything in the building felt expensive enough to intimidate ordinary people before they even asked a question. "No," Malcolm answered softly. "I am observing them." A salesman laughed outright this time. "Observing?" Ethan held up one hand slightly, stopping the employee from speaking further. His attention remained fixed on Malcolm, studying the calmness in the man's posture. Most people embarrassed publicly either became angry or apologetic. Malcolm had become neither. That unsettled him more than he expected. Ethan walked slowly around the black sedan while speaking, fingertips brushing the polished hood lightly. "This dealership has standards," he said. "People spend millions of dollars here every year because they expect a certain environment." Malcolm nodded once. "And what kind of environment is that?" Ethan stopped walking. "Professional." Malcolm looked toward the receptionist. "Does professionalism usually begin with humiliation?" Nobody answered immediately. The young employee near the coffee station lowered her eyes toward the floor. Ethan noticed it. "My staff protects this business," he replied evenly. "You walked in soaked from the rain touching vehicles without permission. They reacted appropriately." Malcolm glanced down at the small streak of dust he had wiped earlier from the black paint. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Because nobody reacted when your salesman spilled coffee near the white SUV 15 minutes ago." The salesman stiffened instantly. Ethan turned toward him. "Is that true?" The employee hesitated. "It was just a few drops." Malcolm looked at Ethan again. So the issue was not the car. A faint tension moved through the showroom. Even customers standing farther away had stopped pretending not to listen. Outside, headlights swept across the rain-covered windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere over the city skyline. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his suit again, but this time the motion looked less confident. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" he asked. Malcolm slipped one hand into the pocket of his old jacket slowly. "Nothing," he said. "People reveal themselves fast enough on their own." The receptionist gave a nervous laugh that sounded forced now. Ethan ignored her completely. For the first time since coming downstairs, he looked directly into Malcolm's eyes without seeing just another poorly dressed black man wandering into the wrong building. There was something else there now. Something composed. Deliberate. The kind of stillness powerful people recognized too late. Then Ethan's phone buzzed suddenly inside his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted almost invisibly before he declined the call without answering it. Malcolm noticed that too. The vibration from Ethan Whitmore's phone lasted only a second before the showroom became quiet again, but something about the interruption changed the atmosphere immediately. Ethan slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket without checking the message twice, though the tension near his eyes remained. Malcolm Hayes noticed the reaction but said nothing. Rain hammered harder against the glass outside now, washing blurred reflections of passing headlights across the marble floor while the warm scent of leather and polished wood floated through the chilled air. One of the salesmen stepped forward again, eager to reclaim the confidence that had started slipping from the room. "Look," he said sharply, "if you are not buying anything, you need to leave." Malcolm turned his head slowly toward him. Calm. Measured. "You assume I cannot afford it because of my clothes," he replied. The salesman laughed once. "No offense, man, but those boots look older than me." A few nervous chuckles spread across the showroom again, though weaker this time. Ethan remained silent near the black sedan, studying Malcolm carefully as if trying to solve a problem that no longer made sense. Malcolm glanced down briefly at the worn brown leather boots on his feet. The soles were faded from years of use, and rainwater still clung to the edges from the storm outside. "These boots belong to my father," he said quietly. "He wore them working 16-hour shifts loading trucks at a shipping yard." Nobody answered. The salesman shrugged awkwardly. "Okay." Malcolm looked back at him. "He bought his first house wearing these boots." The young employee near the coffee station lowered her eyes again while Ethan slowly crossed his arms. Something uncomfortable had started creeping through the room now, something heavier than embarrassment. Malcolm reached toward the black sedan once more, this time crouching slightly near the rear quarter panel. His fingers brushed lightly across the paint beneath the showroom light. Then he looked up toward Ethan. "Your detail team missed a swirl mark right here." Ethan frowned immediately. "What?" Malcolm pointed calmly toward the reflection near the edge of the panel. At first nobody saw it. Then Ethan stepped closer and leaned slightly toward the car. A faint circular scratch sat beneath the overhead lighting, barely visible unless viewed from the correct angle. The salesman nearest the vehicle stiffened instantly. "That was not there earlier," he said quickly. Malcolm stood upright again. "It was." Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked toward the employee responsible for detailing inventory. "How long has this car been on display?" 3 days. Malcolm folded his damp jacket sleeve slightly back from his wrist. The polishing compound was applied unevenly. The detail employee blinked in confusion. How would you even know that? Malcolm glanced at the reflection across the hood before answering. Because black paint shows everything. Ethan stared at him longer now. The room no longer looked at Malcolm like a random customer who wandered in from the rain. The energy had shifted slightly, quietly, like air pressure changing before a storm breaks. Still, pride held the employees together. The receptionist forced a smile again. Well, she said carefully, that still does not explain why you are here. Malcolm slid one hand back into his jacket pocket. Maybe I wanted to see if luxury only belongs to people who look wealthy. Ethan stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. And what conclusion have you reached? He asked. Malcolm looked directly into his eyes. That some people can stand in a room full of expensive things and still act cheap. The words landed harder than shouting would have. A sharp silence spread across the showroom floor while rain rattled against the windows like gravel in the dark. Ethan's expression hardened instantly. One salesman muttered something angry under his breath. Then the receptionist suddenly pointed toward Malcolm's hand near his jacket pocket. Sir, she said cautiously, what exactly are you holding in there? Malcolm slowly pulled out a small black key fob attached to a silver metal keychain, though he did not reveal the logo yet. He simply held it loosely at his side while every pair of eyes in the showroom followed the movement. The small black key fob rested loosely in Malcolm Hayes's hand while the entire showroom watched him in complete silence. Rain hammered against the giant front windows hard enough now to blur the city lights outside into long streaks of gold and white. Somewhere overhead the soft jazz music continued playing, strangely calm compared to the tension tightening through the room. Ethan Whitmore kept his eyes fixed on the keychain without speaking. The silver metal attached to it reflected beneath the chandelier light, but Malcolm's fingers still covered the engraved emblem. One of the salesmen gave a nervous laugh. What is that supposed to mean? He asked. Malcolm looked at him calmly. Nothing, he answered. Yet. The receptionist folded her arms again, trying to recover some confidence. Sir, if you are trying to intimidate people, it is not working. Malcolm nodded slightly. That is interesting, he replied. Because everyone suddenly looks nervous. Nobody laughed this time. Ethan stepped forward slowly, extending one hand toward the key fob. May I see it? Malcolm held his gaze for a second before lowering his hand again instead of giving it over. Not yet. Ethan's jaw tightened. The showroom no longer felt controlled, and Ethan Whitmore hated losing control. One employee near the finance offices quietly pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages while secretly recording. Another salesman whispered something under his breath about security. Malcolm heard that too. He heard the shift in tone. Earlier they had mocked him openly. Now they spoke carefully, uncertain whether the man standing before them belonged there more than they did. The young employee near the coffee station glanced toward Malcolm again, guilt visible in her expression. She looked barely 22 years old, nervous hands gripping paper cups while steam rose softly from a fresh pot behind her. Malcolm noticed she had never laughed once. Ethan finally broke the silence. Enough games, he said firmly. Either tell me why you are here or I am asking you to leave. Malcolm slipped the key fob back into his pocket slowly. You already asked me to leave the moment I walked in. Ethan took another step closer. You walked into a private luxury dealership dressed like you came from a construction site. Malcolm's eyes remained steady. And that justified disrespect? Ethan hesitated for half a second. It justified caution. Malcolm glanced around the showroom floor again. Bright white lights reflected off polished chrome and spotless paint while the scent of expensive cologne and leather drifted through the air. Everything in the room had been designed to signal wealth. Status. Exclusivity. Yet the people inside suddenly looked smaller than the building around them. Malcolm reached toward the black sedan one last time, lightly resting his palm against the smooth paint near the hood ornament. "You know what the strange thing is?" he said quietly. Ethan crossed his arms. "What?" Malcolm looked directly at him. "The car is not the most expensive thing in this room." The word settled heavily across the silence. Then Ethan gave a short cold laugh. "You talk like somebody important." Malcolm answered immediately. "No. I talk like somebody who knows what respect costs." A loud crack of thunder rolled outside, vibrating faintly through the glass walls of the showroom. Several customers near the entrance shifted uncomfortably. One older man quietly walked away toward the exit, not wanting to witness whatever this had become. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. "I think we are done here." He motioned toward two security guards standing near the front doors. "Escort him out." The guards hesitated only briefly before starting across the showroom floor. Their polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble while every employee watched. Malcolm did not move. He simply stood there beneath the chandelier light with rainwater still drying on his old jacket and his father's worn boots planted firmly against the stone floor. One guard stopped beside him politely. "Sir," he said carefully, "we are going to have to ask you to leave the property." Malcolm looked toward Ethan one final time before speaking. "Are you sure this is the decision you want your employees to remember?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Absolutely." Then one of the guards reached lightly toward Malcolm's arm just as something slipped from Malcolm's jacket pocket and hit the marble floor with a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the entire showroom. The metallic sound echoed sharply across the marble floor and then everything stopped. Even the soft jazz music overhead suddenly felt distant beneath the heavy silence hanging inside the showroom. The small object spun once beneath the chandelier light before sliding across the polished stone and stopping directly near Ethan Whitmore's shoes. Rain crashed against the glass walls outside while every pair of eyes in the room dropped toward the silver keychain lying on the floor. One of the security guards stepped back instinctively. Ethan stared down at it without moving. His face changed before he even bent over to pick it up. The logo engraved into the polished black metal was impossible to mistake. It was not a customer key. It was not a valet tag. It carried the executive crest of Whitmore Automotive Holdings, a mark only issued to ownership-level members of the corporation. The receptionist frowned in confusion first, then slowly lost all color in her face. One salesman whispered quietly, "No way." Ethan crouched carefully and lifted the key fob from the marble floor with both hands as though it suddenly weighed more than it should. The silver engraving reflected beneath the white showroom lights while rainwater from Malcolm's jacket still dotted the floor nearby. Ethan turned the keychain over once. Then again. His breathing slowed visibly. Malcolm Hayes stood silently a few feet away, hands resting calmly at his sides while the storm outside rattled the giant windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody moved. The only sound came from rain tapping against glass and the distant hum of traffic outside on wet streets. Ethan looked up slowly. "Where did you get this?" he asked, though his voice no longer sounded confident. Malcolm answered. Quietly. "It was issued to me last month." The words landed heavily in the room. One salesman actually took a step backward. The young employee near the coffee station covered her mouth lightly with one hand as realization began spreading across faces throughout the showroom. Ethan stood frozen, still gripping the key fob tightly. His eyes searched Malcolm's face again, but this time he was not looking at worn boots or an old jacket. He was searching memory. Board meetings. Corporate emails. Investor announcements. Then the blood visibly drained from his expression. "Malcolm Hayes," he said slowly, almost to himself. Malcolm gave a small nod. Nobody in the room breathed normally after that. Ethan's phone suddenly buzzed again inside his jacket pocket. He pulled it out immediately this time. The screen displayed a corporate notification from headquarters. He stared at it for 2 long seconds before lowering the phone again without speaking. Malcolm watched him quietly. "You received the memo," he said. Ethan looked physically colder now despite the warm showroom lights. Earlier he had stood like a king inside his perfectly polished empire. Now he looked like a man realizing the floor beneath him was never his at all. One of the security guards cleared his throat awkwardly and stepped farther away from Malcolm. The receptionist lowered her eyes toward the marble counter, unable to look at anyone. Somewhere near the back offices, a printer continued humming softly like the building itself had not yet understood what had just happened. Malcolm glanced around the showroom slowly, taking in every face. The employees who laughed. The customers who stayed silent. The workers who looked away instead of speaking up. "Interesting room," he said quietly. Nobody answered. Ethan finally swallowed hard and stepped toward Malcolm, still holding the executive key fob carefully in both hands. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice strained now, "if I had known who you were," Malcolm interrupted softly. "That is exactly the problem." The words hit harder than anger ever could. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Rainwater rolled down the glass walls behind them while reflections from passing headlights drifted across the showroom floor like pale moving shadows. Malcolm looked toward the black sedan beneath the spotlight again. "You treated me like I did not belong here," he said calmly. "All because you believed expensive things should only belong near certain people." No one in the showroom could argue with him now because every person there remembered exactly how quickly they judged him the second he walked through the door. No one inside the showroom seemed to know where to look after Malcolm Hayes finished speaking. The rain outside had softened into a steady rhythm against the towering glass windows, but inside the building the silence felt almost suffocating. Ethan Whitmore still held the executive key fob tightly in his hand while the white chandelier light reflected against the silver crest engraved into the metal. Earlier the object had looked meaningless. Now it looked dangerous. One salesman quietly stepped farther back beside the row of luxury SUVs as though distance might somehow protect him from what was unfolding. The receptionist stared down at the marble counter with trembling fingers pressed against its polished edge. Malcolm remained calm in the center of the showroom floor, old brown boots planted firmly against the stone beneath him while the faint scent of rainwater still clung to his jacket. He did not look angry. That unsettled Ethan more than anything else. Angry people could be argued with. Calm people forced you to face yourself. Ethan finally cleared his throat carefully. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly, "there has obviously been a misunderstanding." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "A misunderstanding?" Ethan swallowed once before continuing. "My staff did not realize who you were." Malcolm looked toward the employees surrounding the showroom. "Exactly," he answered softly. "That is the part one cannot stop thinking about." Nobody spoke after that. A customer near the front entrance quietly slipped outside into the rain without saying a word, wanting no part of the heavy tension hanging in the room. Malcolm slowly walked toward the giant front windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Reflections from traffic lights shimmered across the wet streets below while distant sirens echoed faintly somewhere through the storm. He stood there silently for a moment with his hands resting in his jacket pockets. "When my mother cleaned office buildings at night," he said quietly, still looking out at the city, "people spoke around her like she was invisible." Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Malcolm continued calmly. "She used to come home with swollen hands from bleach and cold water, but she still told me to treat every person with dignity because you never know what burdens they carry." The young employee near the coffee station wiped at her eyes quickly before anyone noticed. Malcolm turned back toward the showroom floor slowly. "Tonight I walked into a building my company owns," he said, "and within 30 seconds people decided I did not belong because my jacket looked cheap." The salesman who mocked Malcolm earlier shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his eyes anymore. Ethan stepped forward carefully. "I take full responsibility for what happened." Malcolm studied him for a second. Do you? Ethan hesitated. The answer should have been simple, but it no longer felt simple standing beneath those bright showroom lights with every employee silently watching. Malcolm walked past the black sedan again, fingertips brushing lightly against the polished hood where the swirl mark still reflected beneath the light. Luxury is not leather seats, he said quietly. It is how you make people feel when they walk through the door. The words settled heavily across the room. One of the security guards lowered his head slightly, embarrassed now by how quickly he obeyed orders earlier. Ethan glanced around at his employees and for the first time saw fear instead of confidence in their faces. The receptionist looked close to tears. The salesman who laughed at Malcolm stood frozen beside the SUV with his hands clasped tightly together. Malcolm noticed all of it. He noticed how fast arrogance disappeared once power changed direction. Outside, headlights glided across rain-soaked streets while thunder rolled softly in the distance. Malcolm reached into his pocket again and removed a folded document sealed inside a dark leather portfolio. Ethan's eyes widened slightly the second he saw the corporate insignia stamped across the front. Malcolm handed it to him without drama. Ethan opened it carefully, scanning the first page beneath the chandelier light. His face turned pale almost immediately. The document confirmed everything. Effective immediately, Malcolm Hayes had become majority controlling partner of Whitmore Automotive Holdings 3 weeks earlier after a confidential acquisition finalized through the board. Ethan looked up slowly, stunned. Malcolm held his gaze calmly. I wanted to see the culture before introducing myself, he said. Now I have. The showroom felt different after Malcolm Hayes revealed the acquisition documents. The polished marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the rows of spotless luxury vehicles all suddenly seemed smaller beneath the weight of what everyone now understood. Rain slid quietly down the giant front windows while reflections from downtown traffic drifted across the black sedan near the center display. Nobody moved much anymore. Nobody wanted to be the first person to speak. Ethan Whitmore lowered the leather portfolio slowly, his hands no longer steady. For years he had controlled this showroom with absolute confidence. Employees feared disappointing him. Customers admired him. Tonight he looked like a man seeing his own reflection clearly for the first time. Malcolm remained calm near the sedan, jacket still slightly damp from the storm outside. The old brown boots on his feet contrasted sharply against the glossy marble beneath him, but nobody in the room was looking at those boots the same way anymore. Ethan finally spoke carefully. Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology. Malcolm studied him quietly. Ethan took a slow breath. Not because of your position, he continued. Because of how we treated you before we knew it. The honesty in the sentence changed the room. The receptionist looked up slowly for the first time in several minutes. One salesman rubbed his forehead nervously while another avoided eye contact entirely. Malcolm walked toward the front windows again, watching raindrops crawl down the glass. In thin silver lines. My mother used to say something, he said softly. She said people reveal their character most clearly when they think nobody important is watching. Ethan lowered his eyes again. The young employee near the coffee station stood frozen beside the counter, still clutching a stack of paper cups. Malcolm glanced toward her briefly. What is your name? He asked gently. She looked startled. Claire, she answered quietly. Malcolm nodded once. You never laughed. Claire swallowed nervously. I should have said something. Malcolm looked at her for a moment before answering. Sometimes silence comes from fear, not cruelty. Ethan closed the portfolio slowly. This culture starts with me, he admitted. I created an environment where people judged appearances before character. The word sounded painful for him to say aloud. Malcolm stepped closer again, his voice remaining calm and even. A luxury brand does not fail because of scratches on paint, he said. It fails when human beings walk through the door and leave feeling smaller. Outside, Thunder rolled faintly above the city skyline while headlights glimmered across wet streets below. Inside the showroom, several employees quietly wiped at their eyes, embarrassed by how quickly they had joined the mockery earlier. Malcolm noticed every reaction. He noticed the shame, the discomfort, the regret. But he also noticed something else beginning to replace arrogance inside the room. Awareness. Ethan looked toward the employees standing silently near the vehicles. Everyone involved in tonight's behavior will be suspended pending corporate review, he said heavily. The receptionist's face drained of color completely. One salesman opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself immediately. Malcolm raised one hand slightly. Suspension is your decision, he said. But understand something clearly. Ethan looked at him. Malcolm's expression never changed. I did not come here tonight looking to destroy people. The room remained completely still. Malcolm glanced once more at the black sedan beneath the spotlight. I came here because I wanted to know whether this company still remembered how to treat ordinary people with dignity. Ethan's voice sounded smaller now. And does it? Malcolm took a slow breath before answering. Right now, he said quietly, I think it has forgotten. Rain continued sliding down the glass walls while the jazz music overhead finally faded into silence between songs. Nobody rushed to fill the quiet. Ethan stood there beneath the chandelier lights holding the acquisition documents while the weight of everything settled over him. For the first time in years, he looked less like a powerful executive and more like a man deeply ashamed of the culture he had built around himself. Malcolm reached for the executive key fob still resting in Ethan's hand. Ethan returned it carefully without resistance. Their fingers brushed briefly beneath the white showroom lights. Respect should never depend on who somebody turns out to be, Malcolm said softly. It should begin the moment they walk through the door. The luxury showroom had grown quiet by the time Malcolm Hayes finally walked toward the glass entrance. Rain drifted softly outside now, turning the Chicago streets into long reflections of silver and gold beneath the city lights. Behind him, rows of polished luxury cars sat perfectly still beneath the white chandelier glow, but the room no longer felt proud. It felt humbled. Ethan Whitmore remained near the marble counter with both hands resting against the polished surface, his expensive suit suddenly looking heavier than before. Earlier that night he had judged a man by worn boots and a faded jacket. Now he could not stop replaying every word he said. Malcolm paused briefly beside the black sedan near the center display. His fingertips brushed lightly across the smooth paint where the faint swirl mark still reflected under the showroom lights. Then he looked toward Ethan one final time. Neither man spoke immediately. The silence between them carried more honesty than another apology ever could. Rain tapped softly against the giant windows while distant traffic hummed through the cold November night outside. Ethan lowered his eyes first. Malcolm gave a small nod, not proud, not angry, simply tired. He slipped the executive key fob into his jacket pocket and walked toward the exit. Ethan stepped forward quietly and opened the glass door for him without a word. Cold air drifted inside carrying the scent of rain and wet pavement. Malcolm stepped onto the sidewalk alone, his old brown boots splashing softly through shallow puddles beneath the streetlights. Behind the glass walls, Ethan stood motionless inside the glowing showroom watching him disappear slowly into the rainy Chicago night. For the first time in years, the expensive building around him no longer felt powerful. It only felt silent.